at a university where you've got your court is named after the guy that invented basketball. Your arena is named after, one of the most famous coaches in the history of basketball. And then here comes Bill Self, who has obviously been on an incredible run as a coach over the last 20 plus years. Truly, truly remarkable. And also fitting that he ties that record by beating none other than North Carolina at Allen Fieldhouse. Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible. Paid all who enter, and beware of this podcast. That's right, this is a paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty, and we're here to talk all things KU basketball here on today's show. As always, we are brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. And before we dive too deep into Kansas basketball, I did want to take a moment to give a huge shout-out to the Kansas women's soccer team.
Yes.
Who went on to win the Big 12 title. It may have gotten overlooked a little bit by the fact that KU football beat Iowa State earlier in the day on Saturday afternoon, but on Saturday night at CPKC Stadium in Kansas City, the Kansas women's soccer team won the Big 12 title in the Big 12 tournament, defeating the 1 seed at TCU 1-0. It was an absolutely insane last 90 seconds of the match where TCU was just throwing the kitchen sink at them. KU hangs on. And it's very significant for Kansas. Obviously, it's their second Big 12 title in the last 8 years. They won it back in 2018 as well. And on top of that, by winning the Big 12 title in the conference tournament, just like in any other sport, that automatically qualifies Kansas for the NCAA tournament as well, which is very, very exciting. So it's a really fun time to be a fan of Kansas athletics with KU football getting the win on Saturday. And then you had Kansas on the women's soccer team getting the Big 12 title win on Saturday night. And then part of what we're going to talk about here today is KU basketball at home against North Carolina at Allen Fieldhouse, getting the win against the Tar Heels in the first of many marquee non-conference matchups for Kansas. This one was at Allen Fieldhouse. And man, Kevin, early in the game, obviously it looked like Kansas was maybe going to run away with it. They got up by 20 a couple times in the first half, but in classic blue blood fashion, this game ultimately came down to literally the last second. But just an incredible atmosphere at Allen Fieldhouse. The fans, of course, were fantastic. The students were going crazy. And I know Jay Billis talked about this on the broadcast a little bit, but there's two things I want to point out here. The first is that Jay Billis said, hey, if you love golf, you go to St. Andrews. If you love tennis, you go to Wimbledon. If you love college basketball, you go to Allen Fieldhouse. Absolutely could not agree with that more. And then on top of that, this was the first matchup North Carolina coming down on Fieldhouse, and it did not disappoint.
Yeah, it's funny because of, I think, the Dean Smith thing, and then Roy Williams not wanting to go back and play North Carolina when he was at Kansas, and then not wanting to go play Kansas when he was at North Carolina. You wound up with this gap, right, where the last regular season matchup, I believe, was in the 80s. Is that correct? And
every time they played KU under Bill Self had been in the NCAA tournament.
Exactly, and so it hasn't been planned, and so it was cool to see North Carolina make the trip to Allen Fieldhouse. Awesome as well that Kansas is headed out that way. Way overdue, Nick. Like when you look at blue bloods in the sport, it's tough to not link North Carolina and Kansas for so many reasons. Obviously, Dean Smith, guy that North Carolina's arena is named after, a Hall of Famer, played at Kansas under Phog Allen, who Kansas's arena is named after. Dean Smith, of course, then coached Roy Williams. Roy Williams was one of his assistant coaches. Coach Larry Brown was at North Carolina as well. And so a lot of ties back and forth. And Roy Williams, obviously had Hubert Davis on his staff as well. And so you can draw those lines back pretty far. And it's a rivalry that feels like it should be played really regularly. And for, I think, the Roy Williams reasons, it probably wasn't. But for whatever reason, it's nice to see it back on the docket. And we've talked, I feel like, before about how great it is that it feels like Kansas plays Kentucky just about every year, whether that's a Champions Classic or as part of the SEC Big 12 Challenge. But I think it would be really nice to sort of add North Carolina to that rotation where you're playing the Tar Heels on a really regular basis as well. there's a market for it, right? We saw on Friday, not just the people who were in the building, but people across college basketball tuning in to watch that one. It's going to be the same way when Kansas makes the trip east to go to the Dean Dome. And Nick, obviously you would love to play a perfect game, and you're up 20 and you would like to finish on that and win by 40. There was something poetic about North Carolina coming back, testing Kansas the way that North Carolina did, actually taking a 4-point lead late in the game, and then Kansas doing its sort of final few minutes at Allen Fieldhouse thing and ultimately pulling out a win. I think because it wound up being such a close game and such a tight final few minutes, both teams kind of found out a little bit more about themselves than they would have normally. But I also think that you saw a lot of poetry written about the game after the game, just sort of, hey, this is what we need in college basketball, and that was cool to see.
Yeah, that's my other big takeaway is like these types of games, they're just great for college basketball, right? I mean, Friday night really highlighted like what's the best part of college basketball. It's the pageantry, it's the enthusiasm, it's those types of games. And that was very evident on Friday night in that game because the crowd obviously was fantastic. I saw some mentions that they got the decibel meter up over 130, which was very close to their previous record set against West Virginia, I'm pretty sure, a couple years ago. So the crowd obviously was extremely loud. I mean, I'm sure Allen Fieldhouse, they had a chance to fully display all of the new amenities and everything that they spent all the upgrades on, the new sound system. Probably had people leaving that place with their heads reverberating with the bass they have. So yeah, and a great environment. And yeah, I think on top of that, you want to be tested early in the year, right? Like it's kind of this timeless argument of, do you want to play cupcakes and pick up early wins and build confidence, or do you want to play tough teams and really test yourself? And obviously, Bill Self has proven with his scheduling over the past really decade plus that he's not afraid to schedule top teams. He's not afraid to play top teams. He's not afraid to play top teams early in the year. And I personally love that. Like, yes, let's see what we've got early in the year and what we're dealing with. And this particular Kansas team really stepped up in this game, Kevin. As you said, they got off to that incredible start and really was all over North Carolina early. A very impressive game from KU. And the depth, again, was on display for Kansas in this game with some of the guys that came off the bench and played great. I mean, how can you not talk about Zeke Mayo, the hometown kid coming back to Lawrence? And he clearly is just loving every minute of being a part of this Kansas team, and obviously had a huge performance on Friday night against North Carolina. He ends up leading the team with 21 points. Honestly, 3 of 9 from three. You would expect him to probably shoot a little bit better, but certainly he was still very impactful and very effective. And Kansas just didn't have like we'll talk about all the different players for KU, but with Zeke Mayo specifically, they didn't even have a guy remotely like that on last year's roster. Somebody that could just step into a three and hit it at any moment. And his ability, I think, was on full display. And for him to come off the bench and do that. And there was a video in the locker room after the win for Kansas, and Bill Self said something that I think is going to continue to ring true throughout this season. And that is that this particular team with Kansas, it can be any guy's night in any game, right? And they have the depth of talent to where if Rylan Griffin's having a bad game, if AJ Store's having a bad game, oh, here comes Zeke Mayo. Oh, here comes Floyd Badunga. If, Hunter Dickinson is having a rough game, here comes KJ Adams. If DeJuan Harris is having a bad game, here comes David Coit. Like, it could be any given guy on any given night with this Kansas team. And when you have that depth of talent, that's obviously why I think they were preseason number one. And that's obviously why I think they continue to be one of the top betting favorites to win the national championship, because when you couple that level of depth of talent with Bill Self's coaching, you expect them to have a lot of success. And obviously, this was a game, we talk about this all the time. This was a game that Kansas is winning in a shootout, right? And I'm sure Bill Self was looking at the film thinking, gosh, we play terrible on defense. Oh my God. So if they're able to win this type of game, only imagine what it's going to be like when they do end up winning a game like 65-61 in Big 12 conference play at some point. It just, I mentioned it earlier that this team feels like they could be a bit of a chameleon, or those are some of the best teams that Bill Self's had. This team feels like they have that attribute where they can go out and win any game, which is very, very exciting.
Yeah, you have to be able to win multiple ways in March, right? You have to have different gears built in. I did think there were some mistakes. It obviously wasn't a perfect game, and you would expect that when you win by 3, that you didn't play a perfect game. I thought Kansas missed Shaq Moore, to be honest with you. I thought that Kansas could have used another perimeter defender in this one. There were times when North Carolina was able to get downhill, and quite frankly, a lot of times it was against a guy that DeJuan Harris was not defending. And so they could have used Shaq Moore in there. I think something else too, Nick, they have the ability to win multiple ways, but I do think they got pulled into playing North Carolina's style, right? Like Bill Self, it's not that they play a slow tempo, but they want to run off of stops. And when you look at what North Carolina has traditionally done, let's just say what Roy Williams has traditionally done, because he did it at Kansas, then he did it at North Carolina, and Hubert Davis is continuing that. They run off of made baskets. And I thought Kansas got itself into a little bit too much of a track meet, probably, for what this team's strengths are. They did a good job of making plays in transition offensively, but then they didn't necessarily get back and match up defensively to make North Carolina work against their half-court defense. And so it was maybe a little bit more up and down. You talked about a lot of players playing in this one, and it was a good thing because I think you saw in the second half some legs started to go. There were some times when Hunter Dickinson looked pretty tired, and you almost have to remind yourself that this is a guy that's coming back from an injury who hasn't played that many minutes in a game, and then all of a sudden he's playing in a game that's a full-blown track meet. And even beyond that, Nick, I think you watched KU a really long time too, and when Kansas plays at like Champions Classic, a lot of times it's their first big matchup of the year, right? And so when that happens, a lot of times you see guys get more tired than they ordinarily would because the adrenaline runs out so fast, right? Because they're so pumped to play, things start going, you get momentum shifts, and then Champions Classic, a lot of times you see comebacks and everything else because you see the legs come and go. And so it's not necessarily a conditioning thing as much as it's just, hey, we're not used to playing in these types of tight basketball games yet on this stage where the excitement level is this high and all of those things. But I do think part of the reason North Carolina was able to hang around and come back and really threaten Kansas in this one, it was really impressive that Kansas was able to win at the end, but I do think that Kansas got drawn into a little bit more back and forth, up and down than the Jayhawks would typically like.
Well, look, you mentioned all those guys playing different minutes. I mean, Zeke Bayo off the bench, 29 minutes, AJ Stewart off the bench, 28 minutes. But then you look at the other side of the starters, and KJ Adams played 37 minutes in the game and
got hurt.
Look, yeah,
he was playing hurt for part of it.
Yeah, and look, obviously, KJ Adams, I think, has been a bit of a lightning rod at times as a player for KU from the outside, from a fan perspective. But I don't understand how you can't love the guy, right? I mean, he just does all the right things. He's an incredible hustler, an incredible athlete, and he just makes plays, right? I mean, that's really the bottom line. 37 minutes, and he's very active, doing a lot of things that don't show up in the box score. Ended up scoring 14 points in the game. He's just so impressive. The short roll game with him and DeJuan Harris is perfection to watch a lot of times. So I just wanted to get that out that, regardless of what your opinion of KJ Adams is, he's a vital part of this team. He's going to be playing a lot, and he's very, very effective in doing so, and he understands how to be effective for this team. And he's just an incredible Jayhawk to have on this roster for the last 4 years.
He was one of their most important guys in the first half. One of the biggest reasons that they built the big lead that they did. North Carolina really struggled to match up with him, and his combination of athleticism, the way that he cut was really good. And we've seen that floater game, Nick, it's gotten to the point where it's pretty automatic, and it was interesting because he did take, 3 of those sort of little elbow jumpers, I think 2 or 3 of them, and didn't have a lot of success with that. Look, you may just have to live with some of that, for the other things that you get there. But like you said, played 37 minutes, obviously wasn't 100% in the second half, but was battling through it because they needed him to battle through it. And he wound up making a pretty big hustle player too in the final 5 minutes that led to the win. The sort of things that you're talking about not showing up in the box score. And so when you look at all of those things, it's kind of funny. I think a lot of people thought when Self said, hey, I don't want any of those three guys playing 30 minutes a game. I think a lot of people looked at Dewan and said, well, Dewan's going to play 30 plus, no doubt. The guy I thought would be tough to keep from playing 30, 35 type minutes was KJ. And the reason why is I'm not sure that Kansas has sort of a like-for-like replacement for him. I think when Shaq Moore gets healthy, you've got some options at point guard where you could potentially sit Dewan for a little bit here and there. But I will say in this game, Nick, and I don't want the first segment of this to drag on too long, but I will say that when Dewan went out with his forced foul for a little bit, Kansas's offense kind of bogged down for a few possessions, and DeJuan Harris was really instrumental in Kansas winning this game as well. The caliber of shots that Kansas was getting when DeJuan Harris was on the court were higher, and he played great defense. He was face guarding R.J. Davis on the final possession when R.J. Davis didn't sniff the ball. And so I think DeJuan Harris is another guy that for some people can maybe be a little bit polarizing. He was really good against North Carolina, been part of the reason they won as well.
Yeah, DeJuan Harris was outstanding. And Kevin, you know what else is outstanding?
Oh,
home field apparel.
There it is.
Home field apparel is outstanding. I've got the pay heat shirt here that we told Home Field Apparel to make. We didn't tell them that, but I'm just saying that. But yeah, they've got a pay heat shirt. You can represent a great brand with the podcast, and obviously for KU as well. They've got tons of other items. I actually happen to also be wearing my KU joggers as well. So it's got a little chilly, so I'm totally home field decked out right now, and you could be too by heading to Home Field Apparel. You can find Kansas gear. You can find gear from over 130 other schools as well. Listen, Christmas is sneaking up on us, guys. We're talking just about 6.5 weeks away from Christmas. So if you were looking to get somebody a gift, Home Field Apparel is the perfect opportunity to do that. And if you use code PAYHEAT24, you'll get 15% off of your first order over at homefieldapparel.com. More KU basketball talk is coming up next. Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com. This is the Paid Podcast on Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer along with Kevin Flaherty. If you like what you're hearing or if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe, drop a comment, share your thoughts, share your takes from KU's game from the start of the season for KU, and be sure to check out all of our other great coverage of KU football. We're going to have a pretty special episode coming up later on this week with a very special guest to talk to Darren Peterson and more. That's later on this week. You'll definitely want to check that out on the feed on both the audio side and on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. So be sure to like, subscribe, tell your friends, and spread the word about us here on the show, covering all things Kansas athletics. One other thing, Kevin, that we didn't mention off the top is that this is obviously a huge game for Bill Self in that he is now tied with Phog Allen for the most wins by a head coach in Kansas basketball history with 590. Bill Self obviously very quickly to downplay that and say that he's not the best coach ever. But listen, Phog Allen didn't have to coach against Kevin Durant, okay? That's all I'm going to say. Or guys like Buddy Hield and so on and so forth. The list goes on. So Bill Self obviously has been an incredible coach for Kansas. You don't need me to tell you that. It's not rocket science to figure that one out. He's been phenomenal. And at a university where you've got your court is named after the guy that invented basketball. Your arena is named after, one of the most famous coaches in the history of basketball. And then here comes Bill Self, who has obviously been on an incredible run as a coach over the last 20-plus years. Truly, truly remarkable. And also fitting that he ties that record by beating none other than North Carolina at Allen Fieldhouse.
Yeah, it's a tremendous honor, obviously. Like you said, it's different times, right? Like a big part of the reason that Phog Allen, some people considered him to be one of the fathers of college basketball coaching, is because when he took over, it wasn't entirely clear that you were supposed to coach basketball. And I know that sounds weird, but one of the amazing things I think about the history of basketball is, coaches used to referee during games. And so you would prepare your team for the game, but then once the game started, you and the opposing coach were reffing the game and calling things out and everything else. And so Phog Allen was a guy that really took the coaching part of it and the strategy part of it and helped turned that more mainstream. He was a big part of the reason that the Olympics wound up, having basketball as an Olympic sport. He was huge into conditioning and things like that not everybody was doing back then. The health part of it was a big part of what he did. And they didn't play as many games in a season, and you didn't have, shot clocks and things like that. So two very different eras, obviously, from when Bill Self comes in. And I think one of the things that is amazing with Bill Self is a lot of successful coaches, they exploit sort of a market inefficiency, right? Like you think of a coach in football who taps into JUCO players before, other people do. Or you think about Nebraska in the 70s and the 90s, they were huge into the weights programs being as specified as they were. And they were one of the first to embrace nutrition. And you look at people kind of close those off, right? Where you stop having that advantage after a little while because guy number 2 points over there and says, hey, look, that's pretty good. I think I should also be doing that. And I think that's one of the most impressive things about Bill Self is there weren't market inefficiencies there really for him to exploit. He just did what he does better than other people. He's recruited at eye level. He's adjusted. His teams that won early in his tenure play very differently than his teams do now. He won a national title with a team where, all 5 guys basically were threats, and it was, everybody sort of between, 10 or 11 and 13 points per game. He went to a national title game on a team that really rode Thomas Robinson there with a single star. He went to a Final Four in 18 with a team that launched threes, even though he was a guy that prior to that had, called 3-point shots fool's gold, and so I think the adaptability and the ability to find success in so many different eras and parts of basketball is one of the things that makes him special. Obviously, now you've got NIL, transfer portal, all of those things. And guess what? Kansas is still, pretty high up in the polls and considered to be a national title contender. And so I think that's one of the most fascinating things about his case. Obviously, he's already in the Hall of Fame, but when you start talking about some of the greatest coaches of all time, is the way that he's been able to adjust based on what he has. He didn't run one system all the way through, and he still found these kinds of results.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he is the definition of adaptable, I think.
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes he's maybe less willing to accept certain changes, but still accepts it nonetheless and is very successful in doing so. An absolutely incredible career. And yeah, he's put together a team this year that is different from any other team he's had previously, and obviously still number 1 and has a chance to go compete for a national title as well. One other thing that we forgot to mention with a little bit of the DeJuan Harris talk is, Kevin, we got to talk about the dunk. I mean,
yes,
come on, man. DeJuan Harris going up with a dunk. What was that?
In today's NIL, can he get a shoe deal for that? Can somebody make an Air DeJuan Harris shoe? Because I'm not gonna lie, Nick, I would probably buy that.
Yeah, that was crazy. Totally unexpected too. That was the crazy part about it. It's one of those things where you just figured he was gonna go and lay it up, and then all of a sudden, he goes for the dunk. Phenomenal.
Yeah, it was fantastic. He made a couple clutch plays that kind of stemmed North Carolina's momentum a little bit to where they went up 4, but quite frankly, Nick, they could have been up 10, if not for a couple plays that happened in that stretch. And then down the stretch, let's call it what it is. I mean, if coffee is for closers, then Hunter Dickinson gets all the coffee he wants, because he was the guy that Kansas very obviously targeted down the stretch. There was some stuff for Zeke in there too, which I thought was kind of interesting, because that's one of the questions every year, right? Is, okay, it gets to this point, final 2 minutes, you're in a tight game, who's getting the ball? And it looked like the answer was, hey, DeJuan's going to have the ball in his hands a lot, but from a scoring standpoint, it's probably going to be Zeke and Hunter. And I thought Hunter Dickinson did a terrific job of making himself available, of getting to really high percentage shots. And then he was one missed free throw away at the very end from sealing that thing up, where Carolina's shot wouldn't have even mattered.
Yeah, Kansas was not great from the free throw line. They ended up being okay, I guess, overall, numbers wise, 12 to 17 from the line. But yeah, I'm glad about Hunter Dickinson because 20 and 10 for him, right? Which is just another day at the office, really, for him. So, but also Flory Badunga coming off the bench was really, really impressive. 8 points and 8 rebounds in just 11 minutes. And I think that is what you love to see, right? Because I do expect Hunter Dickinson to be still playing, in the 25 to 30 minute range a lot of times, which means Flory Badunga is probably going to be getting 10 to 15 minutes a game, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, depending on the game. And for him to show that he can be so efficient in the time that he's on the floor and making a big impact, right? Getting a block, getting rebounds, dunking it, obviously, because that's a specialty, was great to see. Because I don't know that you always see that right away with freshmen, Kevin, where they're willing to be able to accept that role and excel at that role. If it's, hey, listen, you're coming from high school where you played probably every minute of every game and was the guy doing everything right if you're coming to play at a place like Kansas. And to step onto the court at Allen Fieldhouse and say and understand, I'm going to get, 13 minutes tonight. How can I make the most of it? And in this particular case, in 11 minutes, Flory absolutely did that. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Flory just, he obviously brings a different tempo of big man than what Hunter Dickinson does, which allows Kansas to be a lot more flexible. And I suspect, and we kind of already saw it, honestly, on Friday night, that people are going to be clamoring for more Flory Badunga minutes. I wouldn't expect that to be something that's going to happen very often. Like, barring any injury, Hunter Dickinson's going to be still getting the majority of the minutes, but to have Flory coming off the bench and doing what he does, and again, my biggest takeaway is just being that level of efficient in a small amount of time. Like, that is so incredibly valuable, and I think really, really tough to ask, a freshman who was a 5-star talent to do. And it seems like Flory has already accepted that, and is not only accepted it, but is excelling at it early in the season.
Yeah, when I was at CBS, I used to call those guys by rate all-stars, basically the guys that don't have the counting numbers because they don't play as many minutes, but you go to look at, efficiency rates and things like that, and they're just off the charts because when they play 10 or 15 minutes, they're fresh, they're coming in, they're impacting games at a high level. And Nick, I know it's 2 games, right? I get all of that. But Flory's offensive rating, 164.7. He's shooting, he's grabbing 22% of the available offensive rebounds, 42.5% of the available defensive rebounds. He's got a block rate of 11.3. He's drawing 6.2 fouls per 40 minutes. And, oh, by the way, he's shooting 90% from the field. Like, that's what you want. That's a buy rate all-star. And obviously those numbers are going to go down when he's played more than 2 games. But at the same time, I mean, that's the energy level and the production during those limited minutes that you really want to see it. And quite frankly, we talked about how this Kansas team basically makes its bread. Like, how is this team going to win in March? And Kansas could win a game in March this year, Nick, because Flory grabs 8 points and 8 rebounds in 11 minutes. Like, that's a winning formula.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other guy I really wanted to discuss here, Kevin, is AJ Storr, somebody that we've kind of highlighted quite a bit on this show early in the season. Seems like he's really accepted his role, right? Ended up playing 28 minutes in the game, had a couple of really nice plays in transition, scores 13 points. That's a really positive sign, I think, for KU, that he seems to be gelling better than maybe he was early in the season. Obviously, he only played 2 games, but overall, this was maybe his best game, I think, probably for KU.
Yeah, and that last 3 there near the end of the game was 3/4 of the way down before that thing came out. And so, but no, I think it's interesting. Bill Self always talks about how it doesn't matter who starts, it's important who finishes. And you look at who was out there on the court in those final 2 or 3 minutes, it was AJ Storr. And I'm not sure that that's a position, Nick, that we would have seen him in even a week ago. And so I do think that when something like that happens on the court, it usually means that there's something positive going on off the court or at practice or whatever that gets them into that spot where Bill Self is giving them that opportunity. And so it was good to see AJ out there in that situation. And so he's got a great opportunity ahead of him if he wants to do it. I do think it will be interesting when Shaq Moore gets back on the court. The Diggy Coit thing. I mean, Diggy kind of struggled a little bit against North Carolina, and he's a guy that I think, do you potentially bring Zeke up to the starting lineup? Does he compete with Shaq for that backup point guard spot? I think there are some different things that could happen there, or he could rebound and play really well, and Bill Self could say, hey, we've got to have this guy in the rotation. So I think that's kind of interesting to watch too.
Yeah, I was actually a bit surprised that he struggled because I thought that North Carolina with some of their smaller guards might have been a matchup where he could maybe excel a little bit more. So I don't think I'm going to overreact to that too strongly in terms of like negative, but again, it just goes back to the point of Coit wasn't great, but Kansas has Zeke Mayo and AJ Storr and eventually Shaq Moore off the bench also for when guys don't have great games. Let's quickly talk a little bit of Champions Classic here. That's KU's next game on a Tuesday night against Michigan State. If you're listening on Monday, it'll be tomorrow night. If you're listening on Tuesday, maybe it'll be tonight for you in the future. Hello, future you. Woo. Kansas is going to be taking on Michigan State in the Champions Classic. Michigan State, out of the Champions Classic teams, listen, I don't want to be too rude to Michigan State, but they've been consistently the worst team out of the Champions Classic teams. But you kind of talked about it earlier. These Champions Classic games almost always end up being relatively close anyways. They're usually very competitive games, generally speaking, so I don't really see any reason to believe differently for Michigan State this year. Tom Izzo actually has some transfers on his roster. Ken Palm has Michigan State listed at number 33 right now. They have played two really, really bad teams. No offense to Monmouth and Niagara. Monmouth 265 and Ken Palm, Niagara 329 and Ken Palm. But two really bad teams for Michigan State, which they won both those games pretty easily. We'll see how they play against Kansas coming up in the Champions Classic. Nick Palm would probably rank Michigan State a little bit lower, but that's neither here nor there. What's your early quick scouting report on Michigan State, if you have one, Kevin, for this game?
Yeah, there's not. When we had Isaac Trotter on, one of the things that he had said was that there isn't really a great Big Ten team this year. There's not a team that projects as one of the best teams in college basketball is going to be. And so when I look at this Michigan State team, there's a ceiling that they could potentially get to that's pretty impressive, Nick, but a lot of things that have to go right for them to get there. And so I think Michigan State, they've been playing pretty quickly so far. It's hard to derive a whole lot from that. I think they're top 40 in terms of average possession length right now. Of course, like you said, you're playing Monmouth and Niagara. You may be getting out in transition a little bit against those teams. They're really big with the lineups that they play. Xavier Booker is a guy that's 6'11", was a former blue chip recruit. He's a guy that they have at their 4. They go with a 7-footer Simon Zapala, transfer from Longwood and Utah State before that. That they start at center. And so they're going to be pretty big in that starting lineup. And so one of the keys is going to be that Kansas is going to have to keep Michigan State off the offensive glass. Again, Michigan State's offensive glass numbers right now are really good. Again, they've played Monmouth and Niagara. So it's unclear if that's going to carry over. That is something that I do think that they'll be pretty good with this group. I don't know that they're going to be, tops in the country or whatever, but they should be pretty good at crashing the offensive glass. It's a team, Nick, that I'm not sure they have a ton of consistent shooting, though. And I think that that's another interesting thing is that we have seen some Champions Classic games that have been absolute clunkers where both teams are basically punting the ball at the rim. And if Kansas makes shots in this one, it might be able to run away and hide a little bit.
Yeah. We'll see how Michigan State looks against, again, no offense to Monmouth and Niagara, against a real team with Kansas coming in. Monmouth, by the way, that was George, what's his face, that dunked on them when they were down 100 in Allen Fieldhouse?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. George, I don't remember what, George Papa something. Yeah, shout out to that guy, whatever he's doing nowadays. But Kansas should be an exciting matchup. Like I said, I expect it to probably still be a close game. That's just kind of how these Champions Classic games play out. Although I will say nobody believes that Tom Izzo is a bigger fraud than me. Nobody does less with more than Tom Izzo.
There it is, by the way. You just got me to cuss on it on air.
Listen, like it was, people think he's great in March. No, dude. You know what? You're not great in March because your team's bad during the regular season. You get like a 7 seed and you have a bunch of talent, and then you beat a 2 seed and people are like, oh, it was a great coach. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that you're bad in the regular season, so you get a lower seed, and then people think you're better in the tournament because you beat higher seeds. That is my take on Michigan State and Tom Izzo. Bill Self's better in March, by the way. That's what I think. What I also think is that you should subscribe, and keep listening and watching here. If you're joining us on YouTube, be sure to subscribe, drop a comment there on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. Be sure to follow us on social media at Payheed KCSN on Twitter, at Flaherty KCSN, at Nick Springer 29. We're going to be having tons of coverage this week. This is a big week for us. Like I said, I teased it earlier. We're going to have a special guest to help break down Darren Peterson's commitment to Kansas with National Signing Day coming up later this week. Also going to get into some women's basketball talk as they've gotten some big commits as well.
Yeah.
Later on this week also. And like I said, Kansas women's soccer going to the NCAA tournament. That's exciting. And, of course, KU football coming off the win against Iowa State. They're going to go play at BYU, who, listen, I'm not going to make any comments because I don't want the Big 12 to find me like they find the Utah athletic director. But Utah may potentially have been robbed of a game against BYU. You didn't hear it from me. So Brett,
you didn't think that was defensive holding?
I didn't say that. You're putting words in my mouth. I didn't say that.
Gosh. Oh, my God.
I didn't say that.
Not just once on this. He's going to make me cuss both times. So, yeah.
All I'm saying is, Brett, please don't find me if I make any comments about the Big 12 you don't like, okay? I'm sorry. Listen, I don't have $40,000 laying around so please do not find me. That's mainly what I'm asking you to do, Brett. But yeah, Kansas is going to go take on BYU. It's going to be a late-night game on Saturday night as well. So I'll be sure to check out our coverage of that also. But until then, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.